At the walls of the fortress Aspiration, which also served as the last line of defense of the kingdom, a fierce battle was unfolding. The orcs were getting closer and closer to the fortifications, and it was obvious to the deputy commander that the fall of the southern gate was only a matter of time. Despite the sheer numbers of these vile swine, the real trouble would begin the moment their lord entered the battle. As a master of aura, this orc is quite different from his fellows. Soon, the enemies were already making their way through the dead bodies of the knights, taking over the fortress walls. Suddenly, the corpses of the soldiers were embraced by a strange glow, and in the next second they began to rise back up, encircling and then thrusting their swords into the orcs. The surviving knights shouted for the Necromancer to appear, and he was already standing in front of the main enemy. As expected from the Master of Aura, defeating the Orc Lord with corpses alone would not work, and so the Necromancer called for help from a squad of huge creatures, not inferior in size to the Lord himself. As he dealt with the hordes of corpses, the Orc was so convinced of his own unstoppability that he ignored a few skeletons who were able to fight back. The undead kept coming and kept coming, tearing the remaining Orcs apart, and soon their lord was stopped by black magic as well, much to the amazement of the soldiers watching the battle. The Necromancer was overjoyed, as he had finally found a body fit to be a companion. Preparing his weapons for battle, he rushed forward, and the very ground rose up, shaking from the powerful collision. The young man was determined that he must become even stronger. He would do it for his own survival, for those he cared about, and also to continue to carry the name of Andreas Cromwell in this world. Finally covering his body with a durable and rather stylish skeletal armor, the Necromancer rushed forward again. The Rodlen Academy is a place for those who have been recognized as promising for one reason or another. At the same time, those who do their best to hide their identities also come here. Necromancers, for example, study black magic. But if anyone finds out about it, they will be executed on the spot, so Andreas prefers to conduct his experiments in secret. This time, however, they were unsuccessful, which somewhat disappointed the mentor. In fact, although it is quite dangerous, the young man seemed to be getting a lot out of it. However, just quitting wasn't a good idea either, as the academy was the only place where one could familiarize themselves with decent books on black magic. By the way, the mentor often scolded the hapless student, blaming him for all the delays and failures. Today he warned him that he would not tolerate another failure, so he asked Andreas to try hard and bring another body for research. The man reminded him that he had only taken the boy out of the goodness of his heart, because Andreas was an orphan. However, he also reminded him what would happen if the task was not completed, and the prospect of becoming another body for experiments did not please him. He didn't dare to interfere, even though the grumpy bastard didn't cover the travel expenses. But one problem bothered Andres even more: he had no idea how to get out of the situation. An orphan from a fallen family, a typical man who sucks up to the strong and humiliates the weak. The worst in the academy rankings and, you could say, a third-rate villain. Exactly the type of character no one wants to play as, but here he is having to go on living as Andreas Cromwell. His real name is Makoto Kaneshiro, and he's stuck in the world of the game Great Sin. He was a special forces officer who never adapted to a normal life in society, and the only thing that kept him going was the video game. He completely immersed himself in the lore, forgetting about everything else in the world. When he finally managed to fully complete the game in week 12, someone with detailed knowledge of the man's personal information and gaming habits called him. The intense surprise caused Makoto to panically press a button in an attempt to turn off the computer, but without realizing it, he had turned into a character in the game 6 months before the main story began. Death stalked Andreas' heels as all the characters go through the same event. They learn Heiron's true identity and kill him along with his apprentice. This is why, unless Makoto finds a way to escape from his mentor before the main plot begins, avoiding getting involved in an event with the main characters is simply not possible. There's no other choice but to get stronger before things start, though Makoto didn't know what to do at all. The only thing to count on are the 2 special characteristics that are given out after 13 weeks of continuous play. Except one of them is random, and Andreas got double essence, the ability to wield both magic and sword at the same time. He highly doubts that he'll be able to survive relying on just one characteristic, so the only thing left to do is to choose the second one. Finally, he decided to squeeze his hand, and a status window with a really rich list of available traits appeared in front of his eyes. Andreas spent a long time pondering what would best suit his profession as a necromancer, but soon the answer was found. A characteristic called evolution caught his attention. After reading the description, he realized that the possibility of rapid growth was the most important thing to achieve, so there was no need to think further. Now, finally, he would be able to see what the future held for him with this trait, and soon Andreas was full of confidence that he would be able to survive and complete the game to the end. Andreas was a very minor character, but is truly pathetic in this reality. He can barely use elemental magic, so a quick leap upwards is simply necessary. It was for this reason that before going to the graveyard, the young man decided to once again visit the dungeon for research, as there was not a moment to lose. By the way, getting stronger is not only necessary for the main event. This world is filled with a huge number of characters, besides Sharon, capable of killing Andreas. The books in the library had truly scary names, but even more terrible will be the fate of the one who will find these books. However, there was someone else in the room capable of finishing off the young necromancer right now. Unless he was mistaken yesterday, Heron's current captive is a vampire. These creatures possess powerful magic and are even invulnerable to sunlight. A vampire is clearly not someone Heron could easily get his hands on. By Andreas' own reasoning, the prisoner's strength could equal that of a mid-game boss, but he didn't even expect her to ask for help getting out of here. In fact, the offer was quite tempting, because as a reward for saving him, the vampiress promised to kill Sharon. She even swore that she wouldn't kill Andreas himself, though the latter didn't know whether the promises of a higher being given to a human could be fully trusted. The necromancer was in no hurry to take his word for it, and so he took some time to think, hoping that there would be a note in some of the books on how to deal with vampires. In the meantime, Andreas had already arrived at the National Cemetery where black mages collect bodies for their needs. Fortunately, the password was correct, and soon the necromancer was already standing over the corpse of a knight, whom he began dragging with difficulty to the exit. Suddenly his gaze fell on a gravestone, the name on which seemed quite familiar. The next second it hit the young man, Aura Master Nicol Lifehill. This knight had spent decades in isolation, practicing to follow the path of the sword. However, despite his persistent attempts, in the end Nicol simply died of old age, a sort of Easterling. Although Andreas didn't understand why he was stuck here, no one in this world knows what heights the knight managed to reach before his death. The young man was already anticipating how he would revive the Master of Aura, although now even Sharon was unable to create a high-ranking dead man. In any case, Andreas asked for another body, bypassing Karen's permission, and in response to the gravedigger's objections, promised to give him a ring engraved with the Count's coat of arms. The fortune to be gained by selling such a jewel, as well as Andreas' persistence, soon made the man give in, and he dug up another corpse. Now the clear future that the necromancer saw yesterday begins, and so he is ready to surrender himself completely into the hands of his first follower. As soon as he returned, the apprentice was busy with the work of caring for the body and preparing it for the upcoming study. Andreas decided to finish it as soon as possible, so he could start training his own skills, though he didn't know if he could work with the Aura Master's body at his current level. However, there was no money to buy another corpse anyway, so there was nothing to do. Suddenly Andreas' thoughts were interrupted by the prisoner, who reminded him of his vow not to kill the young man if he helped her get out of here. However, he was just waiting for the vampiress to speak to him. Andreas didn't understand how Sharon had managed to capture such a powerful creature, but after reading the book, he found the answer. He admitted that he really didn't want to serve as a bedfellow for Sharon anymore, but before releasing the vampiress, he asked her to swear on his family's name. Judging by her reaction, the allowance didn't fool her. In any case, the captive swore on Lucifer's name and already prepared for release, but suddenly the chance of evolution increased significantly. It seems that it is possible to evolve not only summoned creatures, but also those who are not hostile. Andreas decided to take advantage of the excellent chance to test the characteristic and therefore confirmed the choice of target. Suddenly, the vampire fell to the ground and then began to convulse, after which he lost consciousness. Now Andreas couldn't even tell if he had succeeded, but one thing was clear: it should be even easier to start the evolution process on the summoned creatures. Finally, the necromancer decided to get down to business, and soon Nicol's skeleton burst through the flesh, presenting itself to its new master. The lad simply couldn't believe that such a huge amount of mana was required to summon a skeleton, even though it was superior to the ordinary ones. From the bony warrior's characteristics alone, it was clear that its owner had been a master of aura in the past. Finally, the skeleton gestured to the necromancer, and the necromancer reciprocated. Heron's death was still about a year away, but there was still much to be done before then. Not wanting to waste a moment, the boy summoned the skeleton right in his room. Of course, it wouldn't be good if anyone saw him, and so after a while, the skeleton was already standing dressed. Andreas noticed that Nicol's corpse was still practicing even after his death. In any case, for the necromancer himself it was a plus, because now there was a way to develop the second, somewhat crappier, trait, so Andreas asked Nickel to show him a couple of sword techniques. After a couple of exercises, Andreas felt as if his muscles were on fire. However, he was glad to know that in the future, he would be able to use aura himself after learning under the guidance of such a master. One would be able to switch between mana and aura, and wouldn't have to choose one over the other, thanks to the dual essence ability. Of course, the development will be incredibly difficult, but if the initial stage can be handled, Andreas will be able to become stronger than anyone before him. On the other hand, physical training isn't a challenge for a special forces, and so Andreas decided to show the skeleton what it meant to have a backbone. By the way, the level of necromancy increases much faster than the young man thought, about 2 units in 5 hours. Of course, after reaching the next level of mastery, the progress should slow down. Come to think of it, Sharon hadn't summoned him in quite some time, though he could hardly have guessed Nickel. The musings were interrupted by the skeleton, already ready for another workout. Sure, the undead couldn't get tired, but a living person was another matter. If Andreas had regeneration potions, he could train endlessly, but the poor man can't afford them. In principle, you can brew potions yourself, but it is much harder to do it here than in a computer game. Despite the fact that the basic ingredients are known, the young man does not know the specific proportions, so he decided to attend a few classes to fill in the gaps. Seeing a kid in the classroom, who was considered strange by everyone, there was gossip among the students, to which Andreas tried not to react, as there was no need to attract attention. By the way, he noticed that the content of the lecture was a bit different from what was shown in the game, so Andreas decided to ask why not add some more herbs, but it caused only laughter of his classmates. The young man didn't understand what caused such a reaction, because all of the above-mentioned things were necessary to create the physical enhancement potion that was in question. Despite the visit, the necromancer's knowledge was much better than the lecturer's. He even suggested that he should start practicing on his own, but time after time he failed. Suddenly, Lucia Everlast appeared behind him. Of course, she was one of the playable characters, but she had never been close to Andreas, so the latter didn't understand what she was doing here. The necromancer decided that if he ignored the girl's questions, she would just leave, but she didn't give up. In the end, Lucia came to the conclusion that Andreas was really embittered against everyone. It would be foolish to expect proposals from such a person, so she decided to ask if Andreas wanted to do research with her. There was no need to refuse, but the necromancer decided to inquire about the benefits of joint research. In fact, he knew that Lucia had reached such heights in potions not only because of her talent. If she failed to find a cure for her illness, she would die. Even the most renowned doctors of this world cannot heal the girl, and so she has to do research on her own. This ailment is very serious, and is given by the system itself. However, only someone like Andreas, who played so much in The Great Sin, can find a cure. Still, with her sharp mind, Lucia can uncover a secret fascination with necromancy, and that's the last thing the young man needs. It seems she came here just after hearing Andreas' words in the lecture, but he really didn't want to shorten his life so thoughtlessly. In that case, Lucia said that the potion could be brewed by adding peony mushroom to it. She repeated that she knew a lot and could even help her partner to earn money, but he flatly refused to cooperate. He would not trade his life for a tempting offer of a rich girl, as he was sure that he could pick up the right proportions himself. But that would require money, and Andreas didn't know how to get it. Of course, one option was to ask his sister for the coins, but no matter how much of a piece of shit the necromancer was considered to be, he wasn't going to stoop to that. Strolling through the square with a book in his hands, he caught sight of another character he'd forgotten about. The genius mage and young lady of the Alwyn family, Diane. This is another inhabitant of the academy capable of killing Andreas. Despite the fact that these two got along quite well as children, communication had to stop due to the accumulated debts of the Cromwell family. Since then, the necromancer had done a lot of shitty things, so Andreas was sure that the young lady would kill him for even trying to communicate. As expected, asking his little sister for money was the best solution, so soon he was standing in front of her. Judging by her brother's serious look, Amy realized that he needed money again, so she held out the envelope she had prepared in advance. Andreas promised to return everything, but the girl's attention was attracted by the absence of the family ring on her brother's finger. Pathetic excuses did not work, and therefore Amy ran out of the room with tears in her eyes, ordering the guest to get away from here. In fact, the young man had never seen Amy so angry. It seemed that this ring was really important to her. Tortured by a terrible sense of guilt, Andreas decided to return the family heirloom by all means. He wasn't happy surviving in a harsh world alone, unable to adapt to society because of his past. Now the young man wants to keep at least the ones he has now, and so he decided to accept Lucia's offer. For the most part, Lucia preferred to do nothing while Andreas prevailed. Devoting all the free time to training and experiments turned out to be quite tedious, but sometimes her partner does change and helps to cope faster. Her intuition is very accurate, and the girl sees right to the root of the problem, although, sometimes, still pisses off, giving out instructions. Of course, Andreas did it for the money, but working together is really much better than working alone. Soon the physical enhancement potion was successfully created, and the Necromancer himself was able to gain a new talent. He could now evolve the traits themselves, though he didn't fully understand if that meant that anything could now evolve if the conditions were met. In any case, the joyous shouts of his partner, who was simply amazed at how perfect the potion turned out, made him put the questions to rest. Lucia took it upon herself to make an application to the potions committee, despite the fact that she would be busy with her upcoming exams. Meanwhile, the vampiress felt as if her whole body ached and burned. But still, she felt something more in that pain. Andreas was confident that his partner would pass the exam with ease. The next part would take place already in the magic tower, but he himself wasted no time, so his necromancy and sword skills had increased significantly. The young man had no doubt that everything would be fine if he passed the exam. Besides, the vampire's evolution was almost complete, so perhaps it was necessary to think of an excuse to check her condition. Meanwhile, the girls were discussing the essence of the upcoming test. Apparently they would be randomly split into groups this time, so with any luck it would be easy. Except that Diane wondered what would happen if she and Andreas had to work together. Soon the train arrived at its destination, and the attendant announced that the group would be randomized, and the participants would be 3 students from the warrior department, 1 mage, and the curator. There are countless villains in the academy, not counting Andreas and Sharon himself. And it seems that the young man's luck is so shitty that 2 of them are in his group. The first was the fanatic Hazar Gapri, and the second was the Academy's indiscriminate assassin, the crazy Vivian. Andreas just couldn't believe that the distribution had gone so badly, but suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by the last participant, Christopher. He immediately admitted that a mage training as a warrior disgusted him, and therefore asked him to stay away. This aggression caused a fight between him and Hazard, and Vivian looked at them as if they had lost their minds. In short, the lineup is still the same, but the problems don't end there. The group's curator is some bull. In any case, now that they were all together, the examiner let them take the assignment and wished them to come back alive, though Andreas doubted whether they would be able to do it with such partners. On the way to the exam site, the supervisor of the 9th group, Ivy Claire, decided to familiarize the Ments with the purpose of the assignment. Andreas noticed that she was much more aggressive here than in the game. In addition, Ivy will soon become an aura master, but no information about her character is known. Her skills are more than decent, but it's her character that can complicate things. Listening to her taunts about how such a worthless mage was even trying to advance in swordsmanship, Andreas only dreamed of one thing, that they would get there as soon as possible. Finally, the entire group arrived at the Baron's mansion, and it wasn't long before he decided to briefly explain the situation. The tragically missing landowner, Trim, was his nephew. Although he was a baronet, the lad had no family, and that was all the information the man had. After the butler whispered something in the gentleman's ear, the latter stood up and apologized, referring to urgent matters, but Ivy assured that now they had all the necessary details to proceed with the task. Once outside, Andreas admitted that he found many things suspicious. First, the Baron being very calm, even though his nephew had disappeared without a trace. Secondly, the missing explorers, whose communication was suddenly cut off. It was strange that they had sent only 1 group, even though a whole month had passed. But the most suspicious was the butler's behavior. Hearing the refusal of the proposal to stay, he would have a look as if the plan had failed. In fact, all the inhabitants of the manor looked anxious. All their movements down to the slightest gesture indicated that some important information was being withheld. In that case, Ivy suggested going to the village right now, but the thought that this case was not so simple did not leave Andres. As he got closer and closer to his destination, he could feel his mana starting to shake more and more. No one understood what was happening, as suddenly the carriage jerked, after which it rushed forward at full speed. The crazy look not only of the coachman, but also of the horses, which Christopher saw when he looked out of the window, made it clear that something was wrong. Deciding to check the situation personally, Ivy broke open the transport's casement and then ordered her charges to prepare for a confrontation as they rushed straight for the city gates. Once outside, the members of the group found a pandemonium of locals spinning around in a frenzied dance. Now Andreas began to understand such a violent reaction of his mana. All things considered, there was only one conclusion: black magic. Upon grabbing a local child, the group discovered that his feet were bloody, which meant he'd been dancing all day. As expected, there was a curse involved. Christopher reminded them that the landowner had been gone for a month. If those unfortunates had been dancing all that time, they would have died of fatigue long ago. Andreas confirmed that it was likely that someone cared about keeping these people alive. By the way, in the game, Andreas didn't die here. If they had accepted the butler's offer to take a break in the castle, the Baron would have hidden what was happening. But the group advanced to the village immediately, and the situation changed. Clearly, they had gotten into something dangerous. The mana that the young man sensed here was roughly at Heron's level, but to use it on such a scale seemed strange. In any case, the first step was to gather information, and so Andreas suggested that his comrades take a look around the landowner's house. Bursting inside, they found only bodies. The lack of insignia only indicated that they were not Imperial investigators, and the condition of the bodies suggested that they had been killed a long time ago. Finally, Andreas dared to voice his speculations about the black magician who had probably caused all this chaos. According to the Necromancer's guesses, the culprit could generate the joyful emotions of the inhabitants, who were twirling in a dance, for mana for his charms. Most likely, the landowner is already dead, as he could have prevented the plan from coming to fruition. In any case, Ivy noted that the only way to find out the truth would be to catch the culprits, and so she suggested that she inspect every corner of the fucking manor. Wandering down the corridor in a vain search for any clues, Vivian noticed a horde of zombified residents who were storming the manor right now. Hazar immediately rushed to find an escape route, but it was too late. The puppets had infiltrated the second floor. Christopher rushed to the warrior's aid, but the next second there was an explosion that knocked the Necromancer to the ground, just like in the old days. Ivy jumped out the window and all 5 of them ran away from the manor. The Necromancer noticed that he had fallen into flashbacks at the worst possible time, so he decided to do something to help his companions by conjuring oil and an earth shield to slow down the zombies. Ivy, however, asked him not to waste mana so thoughtlessly, and instead to find the location of the Black Mage. Given the way he was using up his internal energy, Andreas had no doubt that he would find the bastard, and the short search was soon successful. Kicking another door in her way, Ivy rushed inside the Black Mage's hideout, but at the same moment a barrier appeared between her and Andreas. The young man realized that they were trapped, but his strength was not enough to break the spell. Meanwhile, on the other side of the barrier, the curator recognized her sister in the writhing zombie. Suddenly Andreas heard a strange voice, and then a rift opened above his head, from where it commanded him not to resist the will of the god and to bow to idleness. What he heard made Andreas wonder why the last phrase was spoken now. Based on the name of the game, the 7 deadly sins, starting with idleness, were separated from the main body, the manuscript of the apocalypse. By collecting them all together, the main boss can be summoned. These are the most important items in the story, which is why Andreas doesn't understand why idleness is mentioned in a village that doesn't even appear in the main plot. In any case, coping with a horde of zombies alone will not work, so the young man ran to find other members of the group. Meanwhile, the crazy Vivian was tearing the villagers to pieces with a crazy look, while Hazard was silently watching the scene. The latter was glad to see his comrade back safe and sound, but Andreas himself was in no hurry to trust the fanatic, who was clearly eager to run away, leaving his wounded comrade alone. Still, as much as the young man didn't like it, he decided to play along, and so he reported that Ivy was left alone with the Black Mage. Assuming that the curator was in danger, Hazar volunteered to help her, and at any rate, it was better than betrayal. Observing Vivian, the Necromancer assumed that something was driving her crazy. It looked as if she would not hesitate to chop him to pieces, so Andreas decided to stay calm. Suddenly, a mage approached him from the roof of a neighboring house, impressed by the young man's calmness. In recognition of his bravery, the Black Mage decided to reward him with a challenge, and the next second Andreas found himself in some strange space. His fingers, hands, and then his whole body began to scatter into small particles, which were immediately carried away by the wind. When he opened his eyes again, he found the familiar tactical gloves and the weight of the unloading on his shoulders. Running across the battlefield, Makoto couldn't understand what was going on, but suddenly he noticed the silhouette of a wounded comrade ahead, who was urging the only survivor to get away as soon as possible. Makoto immediately rushed towards him, but gradually the face of his dying friend began to change, and soon Andreas recognized him as his father. His father asked Andreas to take the family ring, because as long as this emblem is with him, those around him will recognize him as the true lord of the House of Cromwell. Before his death, the man wanted only one thing, for his children to be happy, but the young man was not going to let his parent go so easily, and therefore, to the Black Mage's surprise, Andreas managed to escape from the curse of idleness. The status window reported 100% synchronization of the young man's two personalities, and so now Andreas had access to the former Special Forces combat talents. With the help of his newfound physical characteristics, he was able to easily dodge several magical attacks. Despite the fact that the enemy is quite light, dealing with him without necromancy will be problematic, although no one is watching anyway. Andreas summoned several skeletons to help, and so the enemy assumed that the congregation was already aware. As expected, there is indeed a congregation of black mages in this game, and so the young man decided to take the perfect chance and throw the enemy off the trail. However, the black mage was easily destroying one skeleton after another, and so, having put up an earth shield, Andreas decided to resort to Nickel's services. The mage simply couldn't believe that some pathetic skeleton could resist his attacks. Unable to deal with him on his own, he decided to use a page of idleness to make the curious kid pay for interfering with his plans. Dodging the mage's series of attacks, Andreas still had time to analyze the situation around him. The enemy had obvious problems with power control, which means that he had not yet fully mastered the powers of idleness. The young man decided to enter the blind spot and make a decisive blow, but the black mage had time to react, and in the next moment Nickel left this world again. However, it turned out to be just a trick, and when the mage was about to send the Necromancer after his skeleton, the latter came out of the portal, cutting the villain in half. In fact, Andreas had long wondered who could have caused such chaos, but he hadn't even suspected that the black magician would turn out to be the Baron's butler. Most likely, the latter was also somehow involved in this as well. Be that as it may, another question remained: what to do with the page of idleness? Walking around with such a thing for nothing was not a good idea. Andreas remembered about the skeleton, so he decided to give the artifact to the summoning vault for now. This was followed by a new problem. For some reason, the barrier wouldn't fall, even though the caster was dead. Not that he cared about his comrades, but if he came back alone, he would have to explain how he had survived. By the way, this barrier was different from the one Andreas had been in. Out of curiosity, he decided to feel this entity, but suddenly he was sucked inside. The Necromancer woke up, sitting on a chair, with little Vivian on the floor in front of him. Of course, Andreas was more like a ghost now, but to avoid scaring the little girl, he introduced himself as a fairy. In fact, he didn't know what he was doing at all, though it was nice that he was thrown here. The first thing Andreas saw in this world was a woman of obviously noble bloods punching Vivian in the face. Considering no one else saw him, investigating was easy. Eventually, the young man learned that that woman was the second wife of Count Belcan. This family is known for its outstanding sword skills, so the Lord was expecting a son to be born in order to make him his successor. However, Vivian's mother could not give her spouse such a desirable child, and therefore the girl's life turned into hell. Vivian had no one left to protect her, so loneliness and cruelty planted the seeds of madness in her head. Every day she got worse and worse, until one day the girl cut out all the teachers and their assistants at a meeting for the 5th year. Now, sitting in a chair in front of the little girl, Andreas realized that he couldn't erase Vivian's memories, but he promised to help. The young man assured the girl that she had a special talent that had not yet been revealed, an extraordinary mastery of the sword. The little girl simply could not believe what she heard, as she was always just scolded, but Andreas promised that he would always be there for her. The only thing he asked was not to tell anyone about the mysterious good fairy. Thus he spent an entire month teaching Vivian the techniques of blade handling. With his own skills, Andreas did his best to give the girl everything he knew himself. The time spent with Vivian showed that she was a true genius. Such movements could definitely not belong to a little girl who had only begun her training a month ago. But despite the praise from her invisible mentor, she still lowered her head in embarrassment, which puzzled Andreas. In response to a question about the reasons for her sadness, Vivian admitted that she thought she was a bad child, since in all this time, the fairy had never once shown herself. The girl thought that she was not trying hard enough, but suddenly she received praise from someone from whom she had never expected to hear warm words in her life, from the Count himself. The man could not believe his eyes, and therefore asked his daughter to demonstrate these wonderful techniques again, and Vivian did not dare to disobey. After waiting for her parent to leave, the girl confessed that she had never dreamed that her father would ever praise her. What had just happened had just helped her wake up, and so now the best solution seemed to be to follow a new path, not to get stuck in the past. Clasping her little fingers together one last time, Andreas asked her not to forget the promise he had made to always be there for her. He was sure that Vivian would be able to deal with the past and wake up again, especially if it was the same Vivian as in the dream. As expected, the Baron was involved in what happened. Ivy found out after she broke the barrier on her own and joined the others. Before visiting the manor, the curator asked to carefully cut off the butler's head. Speaking of the rest of the team, Christopher is dead and Hazar is missing, which is generally unsurprising. Placing the knight's commander on the ground, Ivy announced that anyone who defended the Baron was now a traitor to the realm and would be executed on the spot. As proof, she displayed the butler's head, declaring that he was responsible for Trim's murder. When the guests first appeared on the doorstep, the Baron immediately realized that they had succeeded in getting to the truth. Patting the huge and disfigured body of someone who was clearly not human, the man explained that it was his son. Edel was supposed to have died of the disease a couple months ago. While the grief-stricken father searched everywhere for a cure, he was visited by a man in robes who promised to save the boy. The Baron confessed that he had asked that his son be kept alive, even if it meant spending the rest of his days in such an ugly form. Ivy shooed the Baron away, reminding him of all the lives ruined in that ill-fated village, then ordered Andreas not to stand there like a jerk, but to get a team of investigators here immediately. Before he could do so, the young man thrust the tip of his spear directly into the eyes of the monster behind him, cutting off its agony. Ivy noticed that he did it without orders, but Andreas explained that it was better to get rid of the creatures of black magic before they started moving. Besides, the Baron had all the important information. Upon returning to the academy, Andreas and Vivian were deposed. Of course, the consequences for engaging in black magic would be severe. Still, the Baron should thank the Necromancer, because if he hadn't cut his son's life short, the latter would have suffered in the hands of a bunch of wizards experimenting on him. Vivian assumed that the fairy had decided to kill so that the boy would not suffer, although Andreas pretended not to understand what he was talking about. This surprised the girl very much, because it seemed that she would not confuse the voice of her mysterious mentor from the dream with anyone. In any case, their conversation was interrupted by Lucia. Taking out a tablet, which came from somewhere in the Middle Ages, she showed the young man a note about the student's victory over the black magician. Immediately, Andreas took the chance to introduce the two girls. By the way, since he would now be rewarded, Lucia offered to celebrate the success of their joint potion, though the young man noticed that it wasn't even appreciated yet. Before leaving, Andreas warned that he would not forgive his friend if they were late to the magic tower, and the next day he ran with her behind him, although he knew how it would end. Still, they managed to make it in time, so soon both were sewing up the many staircases behind the guide. On the way, Lucia continued to insist on going to the restaurant, which attracted the attention of someone very powerful. Suddenly appearing behind the backs of the guests, the owner of the magic tower was amazed at such insolence, for the guests were not nervous at all. Well, if you enjoyed this story and want to see part 2, post the secret word in the comments. Undead. That way I'll know you've seen this video to the end. By the way, do not forget to be active in the form of likes and subscriptions to my channel, because for me it is very important. That's all for now, see you later and bye bye.